How do you think democracies should be responding to this? What should they do? What should they not do?
What's been really interesting in this, and I think reassuring, was actually to see what democracies are actually doing, not just what they should do, but in country after country, we found actually active pushback. So in all 30 countries, not just the US or UK or Australia, but Kenya, the Philippines, even Tunisia, there was like a journalist training on how to do research on Chinese investments and track that and monitor that. So we see it especially in the media and civil society space. And I think there, real like actual ethical conversations about what are the ethical guidelines. Should you take any money from Chinese state media? If you do need to, how should you be labeling it? How should you defend your own editorial independence and reject some of the content? There actually are conversations and even some guidelines coming out in some countries like the Philippines along those lines. So that's one area. I think from the government perspective, governments are often lagging behind. And in a lot of the countries we looked at, as I mentioned before, about half the countries, it was local government officials or media elites who were suppressing coverage. So that's much more challenging. Anything that can enhance transparency can go a long way. And anything I would say that's, not collaborating, right? Or if you are kind of spurring or allowing some kind of entry into the media market, making sure that it's on, grounds that, enable some information for news consumers about what this content is, make sure there's no discrimination, and just kind of the regular editorial, just guidelines in terms of not sharing propaganda or outright falsehoods, to be honest.
When you're talking about the local officials or local media that have suppressed, did these stories then come out in, like, how did you find out about it? Was it then publicized later?
So in some cases, we found out about it because it was publicized, either locally or by others. So one example was in Kuwait, where a local outlet ran an interview with the Taiwanese Minister of Foreign Affairs. And then when they got a complaint from the Chinese embassy and replaced it on their website with a statement from the Chinese embassy, and it was actually Taiwanese media who reported about it, right? Because they were very upset about that. So that's one way. But in some cases, it was actually through interviews. I mean, what was incredible about this project is that it wasn't my team and I doing a lot of the research. We had local analysts in each one of the countries, people who can speak the local language, who have contacts in the local newsrooms, and they talked to editors and they talked to people on the ground, most of whom wanted to be anonymous, and were saying that these are the kinds of things that happen. So that's kind of, in some cases, how we know. But in a lot of cases, it is that, journalists are just kind of indignant that there was this type of pressure and they publicize it. Or maybe there's some other kind of, like I said, anonymous survey that was done, for example, in Taiwan by an academic that unveiled a lot of this as well.
What's the most insidious and effective type of Chinese propaganda that's getting through in these countries?
I think it really is working through the local elites and then getting them also to repeat these talking points. So it's just so much more powerful. Like, people expect propaganda from the Chinese ambassador, right? But if you have the local prime minister or the local minister of foreign affairs or a local member of parliament who's saying, I went to, and sometimes they went to Xinjiang, sometimes they didn't. I don't think this is really happening. Or, we really, China's really an important player and we really want to have Xi Jinping as just an amazing leader. And we really just want to have, close ties. We really need this money, which in some cases is true, but it's kind of still playing into a narrative that detracts from a more balanced assessment of what might be safeguards you would want to put in place. One example was in Indonesia, for example, where if a significant effort to shape conversation there about what's happening in Xinjiang, because Indonesia is, of course, a Muslim majority country. And so there was targeting of local Muslim associations, Muslim scholars, bringing them to Xinjiang, others who are actually giving them scholarships, and they're based in Beijing, where as a Muslim from Indonesia, you have a much wider array of religious freedom, to be honest, than if you're a Uyghur in Beijing, let alone if you're a Uyghur in Xinjiang. And then they would write blogs and comments in local media back in Indonesia, and that had a really profound effect on the way in which people were perceiving the situation. So I think it's that that ability to co-opt local voices who have their own audience and their own traction, that is through other mechanisms of political influence and co-optation that ends up having is really some of the most insidious and effective tactics.
What's the best way then to counteract that without taking away individuals' right to free speech?
So what's really interesting is that there is an emerging cadre of experts in different countries that are gaining expertise on how CCP influence works in those countries. And that was really effective. Even there could be an outsized effect of just a couple of investigative journalism pieces, one person running a bunch of commentaries. So there's actually an Indonesian fellow. He ended up writing a report for us, but he's one of a number of think tanks and commentators. He's an academic also writing in Indonesian media about how the Chinese government is targeting Muslim organizations and trying to get them to write this stuff about Xinjiang. And by the way, there's also this fellow Adrian Zenz, and he's done this really well documented research about camps in the region, right? So those it works both ways. So having local voices and people who are not afraid to speak up, but are actually increasingly targeting some of their research, their academic research, their investigative reporting to exposing how this works, has a real multiplier effect. And you could see, again, some of the stuff we know about what happened in Israel was actually because of these kinds of efforts, and really did change the political conversation. There's now greater investment screening. There is, I think, a little bit less of we'll just take whatever China Radio International sends our way by local media. So it does definitely blunt the impact once people are aware of how this is working.
And what should people be looking out for as they scour the media for information? Any sort of warning signs they should be aware of to see maybe this is, somehow being influenced by the Chinese Communist Party?
I think one telltale sign is the CCP speak, right? Because whether it's the full title of some official from the China Political Consultative Conference and something else, right? And that's the quote. Probably a Xinhua story, even if it's labeled under the name of a local journalist or a local news agency, right? So I think, Chris, I might let you go and try to see what you can come up with in terms of pretend CCP speak. But, I think it's that type of content is, and wording can be a real red flag too.
Anytime somebody mentions win-win cooperation or China has lifted X number of people out of poverty.
Hey, Bloomberg has said stuff like that.
Yeah.
Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, they got that information from somewhere, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is a really clear sign of how dangerous and insidious this is. When you have just verbatim across the board, U.S. politicians, media, influencers saying, "Oh, well, China lifted millions out of poverty." It's come on, it's a lie. But it's been accepted.
Yeah. That by itself. But then when you try to, if you see in a story or an op-ed or something, that being related to human rights, I think is then the next step
yes.
where it shows that this is the CCP talking point where lifting people out of poverty is not just a good thing that they did, but is a example of their human rights.
Well, it's because the Communist Party has changed the definition of human rights, or rather expanded it to include lifting people out of poverty so that they could be the country that provides the best human rights.
Michelle Bachelet had a quote that was about that when she went to China and Xinjiang.
And what did she say?
I don't remember the exact wording, but it was talking about China lifting people out of poverty as an example of the strides that they've made in human rights protection.
And I think the thing is that when you actually look at economic and social rights in China, they're pretty bad. The way in which the educational system is controlled, what kind of labor rights workers have, housing rights, home demolitions, hukou system, and it's actually if you look at international standards, they don't do so well on those. But I think the other would be anything related, say, to Xinjiang that uses terms like vocational centers, right? So if you see a local official talking about this, or a lot of times you'll just see local officials just well, I don't know about this. I'm not sure. Well, they say this and he said, she said, right? or making it all very relative. Oh, this is just about the new Cold War, and this is just the US keeping down China, and not acknowledging that like most of the documentation that we have is actually based on the Chinese government's own sources and construction bids for facilities that have barbed wire to keep people out, keep people in, and are actually just like, some kind of vocational training centers. So I think it's those types of that very relativistic speak too that can also kind of be a bit of a red flag.